You're listening to Chicago Stories, a new podcast from City Hall featuring the stories of everyday Chicagoans as told to Mayor Rahm Emanuel.
This is Mayor Rahm Emanuel. Welcome to Chicago Stories. We're joined by Tim, the cultural historian for the city of Chicago, Eric, the cultural historian for Skidmore Owings, and we're doing this on the 50th anniversary of the Chicago Picasso. It's kind of the Picasso. It doesn't have kind of another title, or did it come untitled?
It had no name. It was given a name later, just the Chicago Picasso, and it was up to people to interpret what it was. And there were discussions. I mean, the papers were just filled with commentary, even before it was unveiled. You know, was it a bird or was it an animal? And but it was open. There was one person who was a Picasso biographer, and he says, well, what it really is, and like, what's it made of, what is? He says it's all about light and air. And that actually makes a lot of sense, and it dodges a lot of controversy too.
So how does somebody become a cultural historian for the city and a cultural artistic historian for a major architectural firm?
Well, Lois Weisberg, who is the longtime head of the Department of Cultural Affairs, wanted to get people who would represent different disciplines of culture in the city. Mm-hmm. And she was looking for people who wouldn't quite approach it the way everybody does. Mm-hmm. And I wound up being that person. And it's great. It's kind of like being the city historian. And I've lived here all my life. And I love the stories of it, and even the ones that you don't even hear about that much are the real Chicago. So I get to be the spokesperson from. So it's a great gig.
It is a great gig.
So I've had it. Yeah, I've had that since 2002.
Eric, what about yourself?
I'm actually an architect and an architectural historian. I'm a designer at SOM. I just happen to kind of nerd out over these sorts of things. And I had written a book about an architect who used to practice in Chicago and then moved on to California. So this particular chapter or segment of the firm history has sort of come into my wheelhouse as the knowledge center or keeper of the flame and responder to all these sorts of interesting requests. Art, Miro, SOM's older works.
Now, this comes later in his life, Picasso's life, rather. It's like he hadn't done a major piece for a city or a major piece of artwork. I'm doing
first major civic sculpture by Picasso anywhere in the world.
That's right.
And several others followed, but this was the first.
And why do you think he did, and who exactly is the commissioner of the piece and asked Picasso, if you could tell or explain.
The commissioner of the piece was a man named William Hartman. Mm-hmm. William Hartman was an architect at SOM, and he was working with an unusual superhero Justice League team of architects on the Daley Federal Center across the street. C.F. Murphy, SOM, and Lobel, Schlossman, Bennett, and Dart, and Bill Hartman was from SOM. And together that group of architects came up with the idea of a piece of art in the plaza. And according to Hartman, they all voted on who it should be, and Picasso got the most votes among that group of architects. And so from that conversation...
Typical of Chicago elections.
was born the idea to approach Picasso, who they collectively viewed as the world's greatest artist at that time, but who had never done a public sculpture of any kind.
And how did he do it? They charmed him. So first the committee goes and meets with Picasso and outline that they are interested in having him do this. And Bill Hartman didn't give up, and so he kind of hit it off with Picasso. So whenever he would be traveling, he would call on him. He brought Picasso a White Sox uniform.
So you're telling me that Picasso was susceptible to charm?
He was susceptible to charm.
Susceptible to swag.
Yeah, it was probably the Native American headdress that really won him over. Because
this was an actual Sioux warrior headdress from a tribe in Wisconsin. And Bill Hartman knew that this tribe somehow, through connections at the Art Institute, was going to sell this piece to a museum. And he interceded in that purchase and bought it himself.
Do you think the warrior headdress is a key influential piece? Do you guys see it that way or no?
I think the mane of the Afghan hound that he had with his second wife is more embedded in the DNA of that than the.
You see this? Warrior. Okay. The definitions have been the Afghan
hound, portrait of his wife.
There's been a bird, right? And what are some of the other characteristics?
Horse, lion mane.
Baboon.
Yeah.
Right.
I mean, you name it, it was called. And I mean, that's part of the idea is that it was up to everyone to what they make of it. And so the fact that there was this speculation was certainly in the nature of the piece.
And nobody saw the pictures before the unveiling? I mean, not nobody. I mean, but was Mayor Daley informed? Did he look at it?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, sure.
So, but what I'm saying, when everybody was kind of like, "What is this?" etc.
Well,
there was no kind of pumping of the public domain.
There was a show at the Art Institute, a public unveiling, where they exhibited Picasso's maquette, the models and the drawings and photo montages of the model in the space. So. But did everybody go see it? No, but it launched a lot of newspaper crusades against it.
Yeah, everybody knew what it looked like.
Oh, huge crusades against it. And so for reasons that I thought might be amusing in the sake of this conversation, SOM has been, or at the time, was in receipt of all letters pro and con against this sculpture because of Bill Hartman's involvement. And so letters that would come to City Hall would get sent to SOM, and other letters would just come straight to us. So we picked some pro and some con.
Let's read the best kind of example of the pro and the best example of the con at that time.
I'll just read this one because this one's kind of emotional. Thank you for Tuesday, August 16th, 1967. This is addressed to Bill Hartman. I was there. I cried. I listened and I looked. Proud tears came into my eyes when we all sang our anthem, the national anthem for all Americans. Ladies, gentlemen, children. Everything everyone did was so important. I know I'll never forget it. But I did wish to obtain a booklet, but there weren't any more to be had. Could you possibly send one to me?
That was sent from Eric. That was sent to Bill at that point?
That was sent to Bill.
Okay.
Dear Sir, this is to Norman Ross. Because of your attempt to glorify Pablo Picasso, I must tell you of the time when I asked my boy, who was 5 years old at the time, why did he choose Picasso duplicates to hang in his room? Well, Daddy, I picked them because they look like something a 5-year-old boy would have done, and I wanted to fool people into thinking that I did them. They do look like my scribbling. When I told that Picasso was more than 5 years old when he distorted the scenes, my son commented, well, I guess he never did learn. The pictures still hang there, and for the cost of $1.75, frames included, we tolerate the child's whim. I understand, and I certainly do not approve. If more people understood, Pablo Picasso would only be another embittered, unknown, pitiful blotch.
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 How much of this was around money versus spending public dollars on it? How much of it was, Tim, was around the fact that people couldn't get their head wrapped around the art?
Actually, the money wasn't an issue because it was paid for.
So
it's just that people were mystified. People would rise up against it, the press did, even in the city government. There were people who, and I mean, Mayor Daley, he said, oh, it kind of looks like a bird, and he was trying to figure it out. But Colonel Jack Riley, who was the head of the mayor's office of special events, and he went back to the time of the Century of Progress in 1933, and he was totally furious that perfectly good area where he could have a parade ground for ceremonies is going to be taken up like this. And so he broke rank. And he said that if it's art, take it to the Art Institute. If it's an animal, take it to the zoo. And then in the City Council of Chicago, Alderman John Holland stands up and makes a proposal that the thanks but no thanks, you send the Picasso back to Paris, and in its place put up something that Chicago truly wants and deserves, a giant sculpture of the great Chicago Cub, Ernie Banks. And even one of the newspapers mocked it up, what it would look like if you had Ernie Banks. And ironically, when Ernie Banks died, they moved his sculpture next to the Picasso. So Ernie got his day in the plaza after all.
He achieved his dream.
He achieved his dream.
I would say one note in closing to the warrior headdress story is, how does the Picasso come from the south of France, from his house, to the plaza? And it comes in the form of a model. He made two models, and these two models he was kind of picking back and forth between them, and he picked the lighter one. One was a little heavier, one was a little lighter. He picked the lighter one. The lighter one was sent back to Chicago with Bill Hartman in a box, and this was all done in secret. Nobody in the firm, even few people in the firm, knew about it. It was kept in his office. He brought in a young draftsman at the time named Fred Lowe. Fred Lowe's still alive and is proud to tell this story. And Bill Hartman brought him into his office and said, Fred, I have a project for you. You need to work on it after hours, and you need to work on it in a room alone. And he opened up the box and said, this is the Picasso sculpture. You need to figure out how to convert this sketchy model into something that can actually be built. And so he was given a room in the lower floor of the then original building of the Art Institute, where he built by himself, using the SOM model shop, again at night, what is essentially a Renaissance perspective box, which is a 3-sided box with grids on all 3 sides, so that he could orthographically draw the thing in plan, in section, and elevation. And it appears symmetrical, but it is not. It's completely asymmetrical. And so he did all this in secret. And from these drawings, then the engineers began to calculate the loads. And
did everybody know from the beginning that it was going to be a metal? It was going to work in metals? It was.
His original model was kind of in metal, so it was suggested.
I see. I got it.
And I think the architects had already decided that this at that time unique type of steel, Core 10, was going to be the material of the building, and therefore it made sense for it to also be the material of the sculpture.
People knew what it was going to look like. You'd see it in the newspaper, you'd see it in the model, but nobody was ready to see it 5 stories tall. That's
the drama.
A whole other thing. And certainly with the famous blue tarp, and everyone remembers the blue tarp, that got everyone's curiosity. And it drew an incredible crowd for a unveiling. And it was pulling a rope. It then just kind of slowly unveiled itself.
That has its own, the sound of that has its own drama.
Oh, it did. It was a brilliant.
In the sense of the drapings over it. So how do we decide, or where is the moment in time where the city decides both, you have a Picasso piece, then you can stand on one corner, see Dubuffet Miro, but you also, Chicago launches it's the beginning of, not that we didn't have public art before, but that is really.
This really took it up to a whole nother level. And really I always enjoy this story because it's so brilliant that at the end of the process of making it, Picasso has refused to engage in a contract with the city. This is all just done verbally with Bill Hartman. And he's never agreed to a delivery date or a cost. And so everyone's nervous. Is he going to charge us $10? Is he going to charge us $1 million? Is he going to charge us $5 million? Nobody knows what this costs.
It's the first real no-bid contract in this case.
It was.
Yes.
And so Bill Hartman goes over there with a $100,000 check in his pocket and presents it to him and says, we can never repay you for what you've done, and it's so great, and we're so excited. But will you accept this as a thank you from the city for all your hard work? And he takes the check and looks at it and says, no. And he gives it back, and he says, this is my gift to the people of Chicago, now and forever. And so because Picasso said no to a $100,000 fee, every other artist for many, many years thereafter also said no, because they could never be seen to be taking money when Picasso had said no. So many of these other works, probably not all of them, came at little or no cost because of that.
Yeah. Well, it was interesting because this was an era when downtown was being transformed. So a typical downtown street was built up solidly with buildings.
Right.
And so here was this new precedent of clearing an entire block and devoting an open plaza. And so the momentum starts with the Picasso in front of what was then the Civic Center, or the Daley Center. Then you get the Chagall at what was First National Bank, and Calder at the Federal Plaza. And so it was this whole idea of public building, modernist building with public space. But it got the whole ball rolling for that kind of public art.
It reminds me of the constant refrain throughout history of polarizing things that cities build that people rise up against and hate so much. The Eiffel Tower, the Pompidou, and then over time they just kind of mellow out and they become part of the fabric of the city, and people love them. They become icons of the city, and this is no different.
So what's some of your, if you were to walk out, both of you, and say, okay, here are 3 places, besides what's downtown and you know and you can see, here are 3 things you should go see that you haven't seen before but are out there in Chicago, as you said, are pieces that are better than some of the museums around the country.
There's one piece, if somebody asks me subjectively, what's your favorite public sculpture?
Yeah.
It's one called the Eugene Field Memorial. Nobody goes to see it. It's tucked off in the corner of the zoo. But it was in honor of the famous poet of childhood, Eugene Field, and by a sculptor named Edward McCartan. It shows like a fairy dropping a flower on sleeping children. It is so nice, and I take people to see it, and they go, wow, I didn't know this was here.
And it's at the zoo.
This is at the zoo. Well, that's my personal favorite. But there's even sculpture that you see that I love, and even parts of buildings like Ceres at the top of the Board of Trade. I mean, really defines the end of LaSalle Street. And there's an architectural sculpture as well, which I find really interesting. I even look at the Louis Sullivan's ornamentation on the corner of what's now Target, the old Carson Peary Scott. And
The favorite piece I have was at the bottom end of Grant Park. I love that piece.
those are amazing. The beauty of them is to walk amongst them.
Right. No.
And you could even press your body up inside
As
of
it
them.
gets intense and then it gets thinned out as you go to the, not the extremes, but out towards the outer
Agora,
bank.
is it called?
Yeah, the Agora.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. There's
Do
even
you
the
like
case.
it?
Oh, I love it. It's fantastic.
Oh,
I enjoy comedically watching people straining to take amusing selfies of themselves inside.
In the torso, so to
It's
say.
so funny.
What's your favorite piece that people don't know?
That people don't know. I don't know. It's not really. This is a kind of non-answer to your question, but there's so many beautiful moments inside of Graceland Cemetery, just north of Wrigley Field.
I know. Yep.
I mean, the whole place itself is beautiful, but even within it, some of the individual monuments are really
that's
striking.
interesting.
And the one that I find that burns itself into my brain is this hooded figure that's a full in bronze man. Maybe he's 7 feet tall, standing on a stone, and his cape is completely weathered green patinated bronze, but the cloak that goes over his face is not weathered. It's still dark brown, and it's very menacing, and you can just see the tip of his nose. It's haunting.
You know, in Milan, there's obviously a friends group because we're on the 45th anniversary of our sister city program with Milan, Chicago. And there's a group that wants to do a sculpture here in Chicago. They'll pay for it. That's a tribute to Leonardo da Vinci.
Nice.
And one of his pieces. So we're in discussions right now. And they know that all of them have been to the city and studied our commitment to public sculpture and art and the relationship of the two cities, et cetera. So they're talking about it would be most opt near water.
Oh.
So it's interesting in the sense of, we got a quick round now.
Lightning
Ready?
round?
Here it is.
All right.
Bring it.
Ready? Cubs or Sox?
Cubs.
Cubs.
16-inch, 12-inch.
16-inch.
I don't know what this is in reference to.
Softball.
12.
River or lake?
River.
Lake.
Thick or thin?
Oh, thick.
Pizza.
Oh, thin.
It's not a lightning round if you got to help you, Eric.
Sorry.
Well, thank you very much. This is Chicago Stories. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have been listening to Chicago Stories, a new podcast from City Hall featuring the stories of everyday Chicagoans as told to Mayor Rahm Emanuel.